more of an agreement, whereas others say, okay, I am making a covenant with you. For instance, we don't have covenant language at the end of Genesis 1 for the Edenic covenant, but by Genesis 9, even in Genesis 6, we do have covenant language, Berit, where he is saying, I'm cutting a covenant with Noah, and then later on he says this to Abraham. He mentions the word covenant and says, I'm cutting a covenant with you. We have temporary versus eternal. Obviously, we're going to be talking about this quite a bit today with the Mosaic Law Code. How much of it is continuing on today, how much of it is fulfilled, how much of it has yet to be fulfilled, and what discontinuity is there in the Mosaic Law Code. And then conditional versus unconditional. Again, Abrahamic is an unconditional covenant, not asking Abraham to do anything, though certainly the more Abraham gets on board this plan, the more he will benefit from his compliance to it. And he sometimes suffers because he is not compliant to it. But otherwise, in terms of what God intends to do, it's an unconditional covenant. What we see in the Mosaic Law Code is a very conditional covenant. Now, God's love for Israel is not conditional, it's unconditional. We see that in the Abrahamic covenant. But how the people of God under the law benefit from what God has extended to them, the law code, how they benefit from and are blessed by it, that's all conditional. It's all based on how they respond to it. So last week we, here's our outline. Last week we spent most of our time talking about this first point, and I had kind of thrown that in sort of last minute, but I thought that was extraordinarily important. The intent of the law, where Moses says to him, listen, I'm laying this in front of you. We talked about that phrase, before your face. Said this is life and blessing on one hand, or it's death and destruction on the other hand. And he was encouraging them to choose life, choose obedience, choose the blessing and the glorification of God over all the alternative deities and ways of thinking they would have. And those, this is the broad intent of the law. This is not, choose to be saved versus choose not to be. This is for people who were already in right relationship with God through God's grace. God was saying, God through Moses was saying to them, okay, as believers, there's a way that you can maximize the virtues, the values of this relationship, this fellowship that you have with God. Following God's ways always leads to life, to abundance, to blessing. Rejecting God's stipulations for his people results in God's chastisement. Now, frankly, those are principles for faith that continue today. Now, I'm not talking about what aspects of the law continue today or what aspects, the dietary law or some of the ethical assumptions that have been set aside. I'm saying those mechanics of revelation, obedience, blessing, faith, those mechanics are really, they're before the law, they're during the law, they're after the law. We see these in the New Testament age as well. So we've already kind of discussed some of these ideas that do transcend, that they do have continuity between Old Testament and New Testament. So having really dug in very deeply to this passage in Deuteronomy 30, I wanted to kind of back up, and we're going to hit a couple of topics today. The Mosaic Law in its cultural context, and that's basically what this tan sheet is about, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. A basic survey of the Mosaic covenant, the core of it here in Exodus 19 through 24. Then the blessings and the cursings, or what some call the Palestinian covenant in Deuteronomy 28. And then this whole Mosaic covenant is reaffirmed to the generation who has entered the promised land. And before Joshua retires, he reaffirms this covenant with them in Joshua 24. And then we'll go through some of these discussions of fulfillment, continuity, and discontinuity with the Old Testament laws. So let's first look at this chart here, Suzerainty-Vassal Treaty in the Bible. And I'm just going to, we need to remember that the law of Moses was given at a very specific time. It was given for a specific purpose. It was not some completely foreign, odd thing that God was doing with the people of Israel. In fact, he does something with them. He uses a format that they would be familiar with, especially for the book of Deuteronomy. You could basically read the book of Deuteronomy as a suzerainty vassal treaty, something that was very common in the ancient context. A suzerain is basically a powerful king or a powerful nation. And by the way, if you're getting some deja vu, we talked about this a little bit with Exodus when we went through Exodus, so you might have seen this chart before. But really, we're going to focus more on Deuteronomy today and then on Joshua 24. But you have a powerful suzerain come in, and he says to a vassal or a lesser nation, he says, okay, fellas, you have two choices. You can either serve me, or I'm going to send my forces in to destroy you. You say, wow, what a compelling, what an interesting choice. Yes, sir?
Is suzerain a proper name, or is it?
Suzerain that's a superior person, and then the vassal, like someone in a vassal state, in a lower. A suzerain is just a sovereign, not a proper name like Pharaoh or Caesar. It's just I'm not really sure why they picked that name, but that means the superior person.
But the word just means the superior person.
It just means a superior person, that's right. It would be a king in this context, or a pharaoh for this country, but it's just a superior person. The superior person with his superior army comes in and says, you can, give your oath of allegiance to our country and be a part of us. And by the way, there's going to be some blessing for being part of our nation. Or we can wipe you out, and you're going to become part of us anyway. You don't have to sit there for too long and think through this. Now, this is not the best situation for a smaller nation, a vassal nation to be in, but this is the reality of life in the ancient Near East. So mainly, these suzerainty vassal treaties, you see a lot of them from the Hittites, who really were in control. They had a very powerful influence in the region from 1600 to 1200 BC. They're basically, this is a treaty based on faith. If I'm the suzerain and I say, I'm going to do these things for you and I expect this in return, you're basically putting your faith in that king or that emperor to do what they said they were going to do. And the strength of the treatise, the treaty that you were making with him, the strength of it is dependent on the reliability of the suzerain, of the king, of the pharaoh, of whoever you're making the treaty with. So as long as he's trustworthy and will hold up his end of the bargain, then you're good to go. And of course, if he lays out a lot of stipulations for you, this can be problematic if you try to break them. Scholars have recovered all or parts of 57 suzerainty vassal treaties from the ancient Near East. 57 different documents, many of them Hittite, that are in this kind of a format. Especially since the ascendancy of archaeology in the 1800s, they found a lot of these. And then, you ask the chicken and the egg question. Well, did God just take a suzerainty vassal format and decide to use that for Exodus and Deuteronomy? Did he program that into culture from the Edenic covenant? It's kind of an irrelevant question. Either way, when Moses starts talking in Deuteronomy and starts revealing this format, they begin to understand, oh, okay, God is using a suzerainty vassal kind of a format that they would be familiar with in the ancient times. It's kind of like what we talked about when we were doing Bible study methods. If I say, once upon a time, you say, there's a literary format that is going to follow whatever you say next. I'm not going to take it seriously, but because it's going to be about fairies and dragons or whatever if you say once upon a time. But there might be a moral to that story, and that's to be taken seriously. And if I say it was a dark and stormy night, well, you know what kind of story, what kind of structure is going to follow and how you're going to interpret what comes afterward. In the same way, when Moses gets up there and starts giving them Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law before they enter the promised land without him, as he starts going through this, they recognize it as a suzerainty vassal treaty, and that determines how they are to understand their relationship with God. So, I mean, let's just look at this this chart briefly. And again, next time you read through Deuteronomy, or for that matter, Exodus, I would have this chart in hand, because this really helps understand why most of the material is laid out the way it is. In fact, before we get there, let me go to a slide here. Okay, so the elements of suzerainty vassal treaties were typically, you'd start with a preamble that would kind of describe who the suzerain is, who the king is, who the ruler is. You'd have a historical prologue that would describe the relationship between the suzerain and the vassal nation. Now, this kind of makes sense when you're in Deuteronomy, and most of chapter 1 through chapter 4 is all of this historical stuff, and you say, yeah, we knew this. We've just read Exodus. We understand this, but what is he doing? He's laying the groundwork. Basically, God is saying, listen, here's the relationship that we have had with one another. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then I delivered you from the Egyptian bondage, and I brought you through the wilderness to the promised land. And basically, God is making a case in this historical prologue to say, I have been faithful to you. I expect that faithfulness to be reciprocated. If you reciprocate that faithfulness, guess what? That's going to maximize your enjoyment of this relationship that we have with one another. If you decide to blow me off, if you decide to just, reject the faithfulness to God, that's going to really hamper your relationship with God. So again, those are general stipulations. You have some information about the publication of where this treaty was going to be. It would be read regularly. Divine witnesses. You would have the powerful king say, I, swear by Baal and Ashtaroth and whoever, that may he be a witness between you and me if stipulations are not met. Blessings and cursings. You have the vassal's oath of allegiance. Yes, we agree to this. So that's basically, these are common elements in a suzerainty vassal treatise, or a suzerainty vassal treaty. So basically, just going through this chart briefly, that's basically the elements you have. Exodus 20 verses, or actually 19 verses, Exodus 19 through 24, or Deuteronomy, or Joshua 24, use elements of a suzerainty vassal treaty. Again, these are, I'm just reading from the top of the beige sheet. These were agreements that were commonly forged between ancient Near Eastern nations when one was clearly superior to the other. So what's the effect of this? This is God's way of saying, listen guys, I'm superior. I am the one true God, and I have forged a relationship with you. He's not threatening them, but he's saying, listen, if you want to just maximize, enjoy the benefits of this, you will respond in obedience. He uses this treaty to situate himself in the role of a suzerain, and Israel voluntarily takes the role of a vassal. Other nations had a king as their suzerain, but Israel had Yahweh, God, to protect them, to whom they could pledge their complete loyalty. And the book of Deuteronomy especially should be interpreted and can be better understood as a suzerainty vassal treaty. So again, what we read in Exodus 19 through 24, or the format of the book of Deuteronomy, this isn't something that just appeared out of nowhere. God uses an acceptable cultural format to communicate some very important truths to his audience that maybe we don't pick up on as well. So notice, I'm just going to go through the, you notice that Exodus 20 through 24 is given at Sinai. That generation basically passes away in the wilderness. 40 years later, the middle column here, Moses, they're in the Transjordan. They're just east of the Jordan before they enter into the Promised Land. They will enter without Moses, of course, and this is he gives the Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the Greek word for second giving of the law. And yes, and that's the Greek word for it. It's not the Hebrew word for it. Most of the names of Well, the names of many of the books in the Old Testament are Greek names, not Hebrew names. Deuteronomy literally means second giving of the law. Moses is giving them, now certainly he's been teaching the law this entire time as they've been going through the wilderness, but this is kind of his farewell address to the nation before he dies, and he wants to give this generation, before they go in, he wants to remind them of how important this relationship with God is, and to be looking at God as their sovereign, as their king, as the one that they are to give sole loyalty to. Because he demands complete loyalty, and he will not share that loyalty with someone else. And then again, the far right column is Joshua 24. The conquest, basically, as it's recorded in most of Joshua, I think it's Joshua chapters 1 through 12, or 1 through 11 maybe. Those are conquests that take place during a 5 to 7 year time period. But by Joshua 24, this is about another 30 or 35 years after all of those events. So this is yet another generation. So these three, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua 24, basically represents three different generations of Israelites who are being, each generation is being encouraged to see God as their sovereign, as their suzerain, as their ruler. So, again, this is just kind of some helpful way of looking at reading through the book of Deuteronomy. Do you have any questions about that, the suzerainty vassal treaty? The impact of this literarily is kind of lost on us, but I think an ancient Israelite, and even in the ensuing generations who would be reading, who are in the land and who are reading Deuteronomy, would know right away, okay, this is a powerful, this is an important format that God is using to get his point across. So, having said that, let me just back up and let's go through very briefly. We went through Exodus last spring, so I just want to make a few comments here about the Mosaic covenant, Exodus 19 through 24. What we have here is that the Mosaic Law Code is a conditional covenant based on the unconditional relationship that God had already forged with the nation based on faith. Go ahead and flip to Exodus. Well, let's start in Exodus 14, actually, because Exodus 14 gives us a really critical clue for how we're to understand the Mosaic Law Code. Exodus 14, verse 31. We went over this story in great detail last spring. Pharaoh is in pursuit. The Israelites go through the Reed Sea on dry ground right in between. They're all the way across, and the water closes in and destroys Pharaoh's army, or certainly a large amount of Pharaoh's army. And notice what he says at the end of that chapter, Exodus 14, verse 31. And it says, "When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant